I've got a light right in this eye. if I'm looking a bit squinty, that's why it is. Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to Kendal Mountain Book Festival, presented as part of Kendal Mountain Festival. And we are delighted to have Cotswold Outdoor as our official book partner this year. Thank you so much, Cotswold, for making all these amazing events possible. And talking of books, there will be a signing with Gloria immediately afterwards in the far corner. Gloria's books will be for sale there, and they're also for sale in our wonderful bookshop for the rest of the weekend. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you could take a moment to just make sure your phones are off or on silent, that would be really appreciated. And if you need anything during the course of this event, we have a crack team of amazing volunteers in the room with us. So I'm Kate Rawles. I'm a writer, an environmentalist, and a long-distance bamboo bicyclist. And I'm truly delighted to introduce Gloria Dickie. Gloria and I were both on the Mountain and Wilderness Writers course in Banff, Canada, back in 2019. And I think it would be fair to say we're both just a little bit surprised, not to say completely over the moon, that we're both here with books that we've finally finished.
Yeah. I was remarking to Kate earlier that the T-shirt that she's wearing is the shirt that she had on when we met, and I was instantly like, this is the perfect combination of for those who can't see it, it says Meals on Wheels, and it's a grizzly bear chasing a cyclist. So she was a very memorable person to meet.
So you can see why it's a special privilege for me to be introducing Gloria here today. So since that 2019 meeting, Gloria's moved to London, and she's become the Reuters Global Environment and Climate Correspondent. She's an award-winning journalist. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, the National Geographic, Scientific American, amongst many others. And 8 Bears is her first book. And wow, I mean, what a book this is. It was shortlisted for the Banff Mountain Festival Book Awards, and it's a New York Book of the Year, is that right?
New Yorker.
New Yorker Book of the Year, Best Book of the Year. So Gloria, a massive bear hug of a welcome here to Kendal. Thank you so much for being here. And this is your first Kendal Mountain Festival, right?
It's my first Kendal, yeah. I've been to Banff a few times, but this is my first time up to the Lake District as well. So.
Well, welcome, and we really hope you will come back. So one way of describing Gloria's book, 8 Bears, is that it's a very brilliant and at times disturbing book, and it looks at major environmental issues such as climate change, habitat loss, poaching, the wildlife trade, through the lens of the relationship of humans and the remaining 8 species of bears that we share the planet with. So there used to be more bears, right?
There did used to be more bear species, and they used to be much wider ranging as well. With that said, there were never as many bears as you see of like canines and felines and primates, just owing to the fact that they're much smaller animals. They have fewer habitat needs. But we did have many short-faced bears in South America. We had the cave bear in Europe, which some of you might have heard of. But a lot of those species went extinct around the time of the Pleistocene. So today we're left with just 8. They still span, 4 continents, so they're pretty wide-ranging, but they're the last of their family.
Yeah, and they are rare, aren't they? You've given these amazing facts. We have 35 species of canines, 42 felines, 90 plus cetaceans, 500 primates, and only 8 species of bear. So remind us what they are.
Sure, I mean, 8 is very convenient for a book, I will say. I think when I was kind of thinking of this, I was like, 41 chapters is a lot of chapters.
500 chapters. Whoa.
And this is kind of a popular, pub quiz game, is who can name the 8 bears. I might throw it to the audience to shout out which bear species if anyone wants to take a stab at this.
Sloth.
Yeah, okay, sloth. I heard sloth. Grizzly, which is brown bear technically, but we'll take it. I heard spectacled, yeah. Sun bear, yes. Polar bear, yeah. 3 more.
Asiatic
Black bear.
panda.
Panda bear, yeah. 1 more. No, we've got sloth already. The last one is the sun bear, which lives in Southeast Asia.
Somebody. Wow, this audience is on
So
it.
this is a pretty informed audience. That's good. Most people don't know a sloth bear or a spectacled bear, so you've done well.
So we have very different relationships with all of those 8 bears, which we'll get into. But one of the fascinating, more general points you make is that while bears are indeed in a powerless situation overall, you've been really struck by what you call the leniency and grace that we tend to extend to bears compared to other top predators. And when you were trying to figure that out, you uncovered a really fascinating sort of cultural history of the relationship between humans and bears. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
I think that was a really rewarding aspect of researching and working on this book, because I was coming at it from kind of an environmental journalistic perspective and not really that cultural heritage element. So that was something that was really fascinating to look into, and looking at bear and human relationships, throughout time, going back thousands of years. And I'm Canadian originally, so I was familiar with a lot of the kind of First Nations stories that are told around bears and humans, especially in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. There's some really interesting details about, the genetic diversity of grizzly bear groups along the central coast of BC actually mirrors Indigenous language groups, kind of implicating the fact that, these bears and people were evolving on the landscape and kind of being divvied up by the same natural forces at the same time. So that was kind of what I generally knew, but then I kind of kept digging deeper, and I discovered there's this thing called the circumpolar bear cult tradition, which is very jargony, but it basically means that countries in the Northern Hemisphere tend to have a really close kind of iconographic relationship with bears. They're in a lot of our stories. They're, totems. We have this really rich relationship that we don't necessarily see with the other 4 species of bears in Asia and South America, which is quite interesting to dig into as well. But I think, and when we'll talk a bit more about it, but just kind of this belief for a long time that humans and bears were actually close relatives, if not one of our closest relatives, and that was kind of the prevailing notion up until the Middle Ages, which was that, it wasn't primates that we were close cousins with, but rather it was the bear.
Yeah, and then we have all these fairy tales as well, don't we? Goldilocks. I was really fascinated. I don't think I read Goldilocks as a child, and I revisited Goldilocks in the Free Bear. Goldilocks is a real unpleasant character, isn't she? Whereas the bears come out of it really quite well.
Yeah, I think that was one of my first like kind of inklings of looking at this, was thinking about all of the stories that we tell about, animals and humans in these fairy tale worlds, and every single one, like the wolf is quite evil, right? So you have, Little Red Riding Hood, you have the 3 little pigs, there's this villainous wolf, and then I was thinking, what is kind of the most poignant, fairy tale piece about bears, and it's of course Goldilocks. And in that instance, she's the intruder who breaks into their home and ruins their belongings. She sleeps in Wee Bear's bed and eats his porridge, and she's kind of positioned as like this terrible human being, not unlike perhaps what some people might say the modern world is today. But there's no villainous bear, right? The bears are the victims of this kind of human who breaks into their homes and ruins their things. So.
And we used to have bears in the UK, isn't that right?
You did. So it's estimated that bears likely disappeared in Britain around the medieval period. No one quite knows, but they were in the Scottish Highlands. Britain had quite a rich history of kind of ursine entertainment, if you will. So there was bear baiting, in London. There were the bear gardens down near the Thames, which is where they would pit bears against dogs until they fought to the death. Those bears were coming from throughout Europe to kind of, staff these bear gardens. Queen Elizabeth I was a really big fan when Parliament tried to shut down these games in the 1500s. She outvoted them. So there is a rich history here too.
Yeah, despite our love of teddy bears.
Despite our love of teddy bears.
Which I guess has also been an influence perhaps on our attitude to bears. I mean, most of us grow up with teddy bears as kids. And you told an amazing story about the origin of teddy bear, which I didn't know.
Yeah, I would say the teddy bear is probably the singular, object, if anything, that kind of changed our relationship to bears in the 20th century. So, very abridged version was that Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. president, was on a bear hunting trip. His companions had run ahead, and they had tied a bear to a tree for him to then shoot. When he got there, he was like, "That's not very sportsmanlike," refused to do it. His friends then killed the bear, so it was not actually a happy ending. But there was a cartoon that was drawn of this occasion, and that became, a toy maker saw it and created the teddy bear. So
we have this unusually, relatively positive, kind of historical at least, relationship with bears, and often culturally we're brought up to think of them still as very different from the wolf category, right? And they're still on 4 out of the 7 continents, despite the way that trajectory has changed into a sad story. We still have them on 4 out of 7 continents. And they're incredibly diverse, aren't they, bears? They live in all sorts of different habitats, and they're all sorts of different shapes and sizes.
I think it's really interesting because people tend to think of bears as these kind of singular predators at the top of the food chain. And in so many instances, bears aren't that carnivorous. I think really only the polar bear is the bear that eats a lot of meat. The sun bear eats honey, it eats figs. The sloth bear mostly eats insects. Even the American black bear, it's berries are most of its food. Its food supply. So I think there's kind of this misinformation around just how carnivorous bears can be, and that makes them really adapted to all of these unique environments. When I was in Ecuador and Peru, the bears there, they build these little tree forts up in the canopy, and they're often eating bromeliads and avocados, and meat is a very small part of their diet.
And they play super useful roles in ecosystems, don't they? I mean, I think we used to think of top predators as sort of teetering magnificently but uselessly at the top of the ecological pyramid, and bears are a top predator. But now we've learned that actually top predators are super important in terms of their ecosystem function. And this is true of bears too, isn't it?
I mean, I think they're just, in the instances where they're not so predatory, they're just a keystone species, right? And they've also been referred to as a cultural keystone species as well for how big of an impact they've had on humans. But some of the kind of fun examples of that is, again, going back to the west coast of Canada, when bears feed in the salmon rivers, they pull the salmon carcasses in, and they're eating them and snuffling about. And then when those carcasses decay, the salmon fertilize the ancient cedar trees. So they're kind of linking that river ecosystem with the woods. And there's another example, too, of, I think, some researchers in Colorado looked at how many seedlings had stemmed from a single black bear poop, and it was 1,200 seedlings when they were moving throughout the forest.
1,200 seedlings from one pile of poop.
From one pile of poop, yeah.
I think we need more bears, more bears. So I'm kind of curious about your personal journey and what led you to this point of writing a book about bears. And you say as a child you were obsessed with wild creatures, which is another thing that we definitely share. Where did you grow up, and were there many wild creatures around you?
So I grew up in Ontario, Canada, but I was near Toronto, London, Canada, actually, which is the much worse London compared to where I live now. And no, it's a very suburban city. So we had squirrels, we had a few white-tailed deer. I used to sit in the backyard with one of the first iterations of digital cameras, trying to take photos of squirrels, imagining myself, working for National Geographic with much more charismatic megafauna. But no, so there were very few kind of top predators when I lived there. And then I moved to Boulder, Colorado in 2013 for my master's in environmental journalism. And my grandparents lived near Banff National Park, again, going back to Banff. So I was kind of used, when I had visited there, to seeing all of the infrastructure they had for garbage and dealing with bears coming into town and these secured garbage facilities in Banff. And when I moved to Boulder, there were all of these black bears coming down to town, and they were eating the garbage. Lots of frat houses, sorority houses, so trash typically was kind of spewing throughout the alleyways, and black bears were coming in, and they were, eating all night. They were falling asleep in trees, and then they were being shot by wildlife managers as kind of a threat to the town. And so that was kind of what first struck me in Boulder, was seeing this kind of close. It wasn't how I pictured, the bear-human relationship, I guess. Boulder is against the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, which is why it's, just to clarify, why it's so close. And so I got wind of this group of people called bear sitters, and it was a volunteer coalition of mostly retirees who would go out and they would sit underneath the trees where the bears had fallen asleep. And they would sit there with whistles and pots and pans, and they would try to keep people away during the daytime. So people want to see a bear, right? You hear there's a bear in town, everyone shows up to try and get a photo of the bear, and typically there were cubs as well. So their job was just to make sure that no one got too close to the bear and that it could leave safely at night and go back to the mountains. And so I started hanging out with this group of people. Whenever I'd get a text or a call, there's a bear up on 9th Street, I'd go out with them. And that was kind of my first encounters with bears, and that's kind of the jumping off point for this entire book, I guess, a decade later.
Except for that one story which we must share. because I so felt for you when I read this. You did at one point go into the Rockies on holiday with your parents, and they put you on a lead in case you met a bear.
That's true, yes. I feel like this was a very long, kind of full circle, like late life stage rebellion against not getting to see bears when I was a child. To be fair, I was quite young. I was like under 5. I was not like a 12-year-old on a leash. But no, my mom was very afraid that I would be killed by a grizzly bear in Banff. So I would always try and run ahead to go in hopes of seeing a bear, and that was, getting back.
Oh. So anyway, so you've gone from being on a lead held back to the bear to being absolutely surrounded by bears.
My mom is not happy.
I can imagine. And I guess one of the key questions you went into this book with, suddenly you're in Boulder, you're surrounded by these, bears. You describe it as the wilderness-urban interface, the WUI.
Yeah.
And in the WUI, you get all of these conflicts between humans and bears. And you get really fascinated by this, and then you take that question into the book. Can humans learn or maybe relearn how to coexist with bears?
Yeah, the WUI is a phrase I first heard of. It's typically used by fire managers for wildfire. Typically that's how that term is initially used, but I think it's also come to represent these kind of zones of human-wildlife conflict as well, right? Whether it's Lake Tahoe or Aspen, but there are places in the Pyrenees here, I'm sure that could kind of fit that model as well. Yeah. Not so much in the UK because you don't have the animals that will eat you. But yeah, that was kind of my conception of where are these zones around the world where kind of humans and bears keep running into each other. India has it, China has it, the Andes have it, so.
And you make the point that given our history with bears, if we can't learn to look after bears, then what can we learn to look after?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of they're a cultural test case in many ways because so many people feel strongly connected to bears and love bears. And I think I got a little bit of flack for perhaps choosing to do a book on such an animal that's already so beloved as opposed to shedding light on, I don't know, like the naked mole rat or something that's like not as good of, not that needs more attention to. And I don't think bears need more attention, but at the same time, if we can't learn to even kind of save one of the most beloved animals, then what will we be willing to save? And I think that's kind of a poignant question that I kind of put to audiences and readers of this book is if we can't, pull these animals back from the brink. 6 of the 8 are threatened with extinction. Only the American black bear and the brown bear are considered to be secure globally. So if we can't manage to save those other 6, it seems like we don't have much hope for other biodiversity.
So let's dive into some bears. Let's start with South America. And let's start with Paddington Bear. Tell us about that amazing story, because Michael Bond originally had Paddington Bear come from darkest Africa, didn't he? And then his agent pointed out there was a bit of a problem with that.
Yeah, there are no bears in Africa. There did used to be bears in North Africa in the Atlas Mountains. It's thought that the bears in that area disappeared due to the Roman games. A lot of animals were taken from North Africa for the gladiator battles. Bears were among them. They were a popular kind of halftime entertainment in the pits of Rome. Michael Bond, who wrote Paddington, had written that he came from Africa. His agent went back to him, told him to do a bit more research, and then he was trying to figure out, he didn't want to do a well-known bear, right? He wanted to kind of look for the bears on the fringes, and he came across the spectacled bear, or the Andean bear, as it's also known, from Peru. And so that's how we have Paddington from Peru today. He does not look like a spectacled bear. Spectacled bears are named that because they have facial markings, which looks like they're wearing spectacles. They don't eat marmalade sandwiches, to my knowledge, either. But that's kind of his origin story.
And I must quote the line from the letter from the agent that you refer to. And the agent wrote to Michael Bond, "There are plenty of bears in Asia, Europe, and America, and quite a few in the stock exchange." But he chose the spectacled bear from darkest Peru in his book. So you've described those facial markings, and they can be distinguished one from another by them, can't they? Where do they live, and what do they eat, and what kind of characters do they have?
The spectacled bear is a very shy bear. So as I mentioned earlier, they're not a bear that would typically eat a lot of meat. They do occasionally run into conflicts with farmers in the kind of Andes because they will eat cattle. There's some debate as to whether or not they're killing the cattle or the cattle are already dead and they're eating, what's left. But they're largely bears that like to eat these spiky plants that grow in the cloud forests of Peru, which are called bromeliads or epiphytic bromeliads, so vegetarians. They're threatened a lot by mining and climate change as well. And in these cloud forests, they also extend up into the Paramo, which is kind of like the grassland in the high Andes. I think you've cycled through there quite a bit. Did you see a spectacled bear? No.
No, I was taken into the Paramo to look
Okay.
for a spectacled
Okay,
bear.
as was I.
And we saw evidence of
Yes,
them having eaten the.
Okay, you're at the same
bromeliads.
level as I am. Because I also did
never
not
saw
see
one.
one. I was there for a few months. They remained elusive throughout that time. We did see some bears who'd been rescued from livestock conflicts, and they were in captivity. But essentially, I don't know if you want to talk about the threats to them as well. What's happening?
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. So they're very dependent on these cloud forest plants, and it's a very kind of narrow tropical forest. It's they're very specialized to live in this environment. And for some reason, the bears will not use the lower parts of the mountain. They won't go down into the Amazon. And scientists are really worried about that because climate change is shifting the cloud forests upslope. And this kind of eventually it hits that limit. So you're shrinking the bear's habitat over time. And if the bears can't adapt to live, in more of this tropical Amazon forest, they're quite concerned they'll go extinct because it's already a pretty small population throughout Bolivia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador. So they're quite threatened.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating, isn't it? The way fascinating and actually fairly horrific that actually trees are moving uphill to get away from the warmer temperatures, and then that changes the habitat for all these other species. And you say, I didn't realize this, that for Michael Bond, Paddington was actually sort of a parable about human refugees. And your point is that unless we get to grips with climate change and habitat loss, actually the bear itself will become a refugee.
Yeah, it's kind of the cruel irony of decades of, I guess, human encroachment is that, the bear itself becomes a refugee that it was supposed to be an analogy for. Yeah.
So let's move on to Asia. And in Asia, oh my goodness, here we have some of the best and the worst stories about the humans' relationship with bears. I mean, let's start with the sloth bear, partly because the sloth bear is quite a contrast in terms of character, isn't he, to the spectacled bear?
Yeah, he's very much the foil to the spectacled bear. And I'm curious how many people would think that the sloth bear is in fact the world's deadliest bear, because it does not sound like that by its name. But owing to the fact that the sloth bear lives on the Indian subcontinent, so it's running into a lot of people who are headed into the forest. They're gathering mawa flowers to make liquor, they're gathering tendu leaves for cigarettes, and all too often they end up scaring the sloth bears that's moving through the same forest. So they'll be down kind of picking up, filling their baskets, so the sloth bears also kind of snuffling along, and they, run into each other. And unfortunately, sloth bears are very, very aggressive bears. Scientists aren't quite sure why that's the case, but they do live with tigers on the landscape, and they're used to fighting tigers and protecting their cubs. And if you've ever seen, there's some videos online of sloth bears and tigers fighting, and it's quite horrific to imagine that kind of fury being unleashed on a human. And so I spent a few months traveling throughout India, interviewing people who'd been attacked or who had family members who'd been killed by sloth bears. And there was one instance when we went to this village. We were looking for someone who'd been attacked a few years prior to interview her. And we were asking for directions as to where she was currently living. And this man said, oh no, she's still in the hospital. And we're like, well, no, this was years ago. Like, she's not still in the hospital. And then eventually through further conversation, it became evident that someone else had just been attacked by a bear the day before. So that's how common these attacks are in parts of central India. We're talking hundreds a year. There's instances where a sloth bear might kill 5 people at one time. And so that's really creating, a big management issues, especially kind of the protected areas in India are typically set aside for tigers, right? That's the biggest cares. Bears are kind of like our biggest megafauna in Canada, so they get a lot of attention. But in India, it's very much the tiger, and so often those spaces are protected, thinking about what tigers need, and that pushes the sloth bears out of these parks and into those buffer zones and into villages where people are attacked and killed. And so there's a lot of revenge killing of sloth bears happening in India. And during times of drought, during times of water stress, you see huge increases in those conflicts because the animals are desperate. They're looking for water, they're leaving the parks, they're coming into towns, and with climate change, that's, of course, another concern that scientists are looking into.
Sure. And it was the sloth bear that used to be used as dancing bears. Which...
It was, and in some cases they still are. I think that was kind of a reckoning for me because I'd spent, many weeks interviewing people who were significant victims of sloth bears, and then to turn around and look at the other side of this, which is that for a long time, a nomadic group known as the Calendars kind of busked these dancing bears or dancing sloth bears, from town to town to make money. And the practices by which they did that was they would take the cubs when they're very young. They typically kill the mother to get the cubs, and then they would pierce their muzzle and put a rope or a chain through it, and they would train the bears to dance, because bears don't naturally dance, using hot logs or hot coals, so the bears would kind of rear up and go like this. And beginning in 2008, there was a crackdown on this practice in India. So a lot of those bears, they'll say all of those bears, have now moved into different sanctuaries across India, which I visited. Some people who had those bears did move across the border into Nepal, and occasionally you do still see dancing bears. But by and large, the practice has come to an end, and the people who are dancing those bears now work in the sanctuaries as well. So they work as food cutters, they make souvenirs and handicrafts to sell. So it's been this kind of regime change in India in the past couple of decades.
Yeah, and I was really fascinated to read that it was actually Indira Gandhi who outlawed the dancing bear practice in 1972.
It was, yeah. She was a big champion of wildlife, but it took decades for it to actually be implemented.
Unlike Queen Elizabeth I, right?
Unlike her.
So let's get the cruelty cases out of the way. I mean, if we now look at the Asian black bear or the moon bear, I mean, this situation's even worse in many ways, isn't it? Tell us about the bile bears, maybe fairly briefly.
Sure, I can skim over the atrocities that bile bears suffer. So we mentioned at the beginning, there are two bears, the moon bear and the sun bear, and they are the two biggest victims of the bear bile trade. And so to take a step backward and explain what bear bile is, it is the liquid bile. We have bile too, it's in our gallbladders, and it's been used in traditional medicine in Asia for thousands of years. Ironically, there are some medicinal, kind of Western science would say that it does have medicinal properties. It can treat neurodegenerative diseases like Lou Gehrig's or Parkinson's, but largely people, across Vietnam and Cambodia and China, they're drinking it or rubbing it on their joints to deal with colds, hangovers, sore joints. It's not something that they couldn't take something else for. But unfortunately, the way that they get the bile, it used to be that you would kill the bear and you would carve out its gallbladder and you would drain it, and that's how you had your bile. But beginning in the 1980s, China and North Korea developed bear bile farming. So to skim over, essentially bears are held captive, the bile is drained through either like a live catheter or they knock the bear out every few weeks to extract the bile, but they're kept in these very tiny cages, for years, if not decades. Bears live a long time. Typically they might succumb to some of their injuries from not being able to move, so maybe it's only a few years. But the issue for wild bears with this farming is that these bears aren't born on farms. They're taken from the wild. Moon bears are taken from the wild. Sun bears are taken from the wild to be held captive on these farms. And that's had a big impact on bear populations throughout a lot of Southeast Asia. In addition to obviously, the animal cruelty concerns, there's also a big impact on biodiversity for this practice.
I mean, I found these chapters hard to read. How did you feel as a researcher going in to look for bile bears still being held, many of them illegally? I mean, that must have been emotionally really difficult and also quite dangerous for you, I would imagine, because you were undercover a few times, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, on that side, it was a bit of a mix. I mean, I was expecting kind of these seedy backroom dealings. I went to Vietnam to look at bear bile farming because the situation in China is very different. It's a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry in China. So whereas in Vietnam, it's actually families who have, a couple bears in their backyard, more or less. There were some operations that had, 30 bears that I saw. But a lot of people were very friendly and they were very welcoming. And it was this, it was like if you had a dog or a cat or some backyard chickens would probably be a good analogy for how they kind of saw their bears. And they were also a status symbol too. Like having a bear meant that you were wealthy enough to have a bear that gave you bile. But I think when I was reporting it, you kind of put a bit of a wall up as a journalist, and you're not really processing it until, I think writing it was more difficult. Yeah. Going back and digging through things without that kind of guard up was a lot harder. But there are some signs of hope which we can
Yeah, I mean, the signs of hope, well, it was helpful for me reading those chapters that actually the attitudes around the world are changing now, and Vietnamese medicine is trying to outlaw bile bear. And, well, you tell us.
So yeah, Vietnam had made bear bile farming actually illegal many decades ago, but they kind of had this loophole of you can keep your bears as pets because they didn't know what to do with, thousands of moon bears suddenly on the streets if they were just to completely ban it. And so it's taken many decades to get the rescue centers and the sanctuaries in place to be able to accept all of these bears coming off of farms. And so in 2017, the Vietnamese government signed a memorandum of understanding with the farmers that every single bear would need to be in a sanctuary by the end of 2022. COVID delayed that. But there's another sanctuary opening this very month in central Vietnam that has space to take every single last bear in the country. So by probably next year, bear bile farming will be done in Vietnam.
Wow, that's a fantastic thought, isn't it? Yeah, really, really powerful source of hope there. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the panda bear, the third Asian bear. I mean, and my goodness, you couldn't get a bigger contrast in terms of how the panda bear is treated, could you?
No, that was what really struck me, and I'm sure, I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to kind of all the panda diplomacy news. The US just sent their pandas back. Edinburgh is sending your pandas back. I think the end of the year, they have to go back to China too. But no, so I went to Sichuan, China for a few months to kind of look at how pandas were treated culturally there, but also efforts to breed pandas in captivity in China and what was being done to get those pandas ostensibly back to the wild. Many more are being used as kind of these, China would call them friendship envoys, but bribes in some cases to go to zoos in other countries. And it was really quite jarring to see how pandas were treated when we had, in Chengdu specifically, there was a bear bile sanctuary just down the street from the panda center. These, by whatever fate, two very different stories, but both bears endangered, so.
Yeah. I mean, why do you think there are such different attitudes to these two bears on the same continent?
I mean, I think part of it's almost like market economics, which is that the panda only exists in China, right? Like they've always had this very strong cultural hold on the Chinese because it's synonymous with the country, much as like the bald eagle would be in the US, whereas moon bears and other bears can be found.
Right, okay.
They're wider ranging, so it's kind of distinctly Chinese, and it's kind of come up as that. It shows, I guess, the power of a cultural icon, right? Like if you feel that other countries are judging you for how you treat this one animal, you're going to do everything you can to kind of make sure it doesn't go extinct, but also cash in on it in some cases too, which China has done with pandas. It's not just that they love pandas, it's that pandas also receive $1 million per year in zoo loan fees that comes into the economy. So.
And it's become a sort of symbol of conservation worldwide, hasn't it?
And it's become a symbol of conservation worldwide. Fun fact, the panda was initially chosen as a symbol for the World Wildlife Fund because it saved on printer ink because it was black and white. That was part of the design process, was not having a colorful animal. I think polar bear would have been a bit hard.
Your naked mole would have done the job.
Yeah. So it wasn't totally selfless, which is why they chose the panda. But again, what does it say about society if we let the poster child of biodiversity go extinct? And so there's been just so much, more money has been spent to save the panda than any other animal.
And they're not easy to look after, are they? Right? They pretty much only eat bamboo.
They do pretty much. I go back and forth on this because people like to talk about how kind of bumbling and stupid pandas are. But I'm like, but they managed to hang on during like a period of insane population growth in China, right? Like they know how to breed in the wild when they have all of those pheromones and they can kind of cue into the natural system. But they are very picky eaters. They do depend solely on bamboo, which is fine when there's lots of bamboo forests. Not so great when you have humans tearing out those bamboo forests for cities. So, yes.
And their reproduction in captivity is a whole story in itself, isn't it?
It is a whole story. Maybe some people have heard of this before, but they do not like to breed in captivity. And so it took scientists, decades to figure out how to essentially mate and breed pandas. I interviewed one scientist who's kind of the man behind the machine known as Papa Panda. and he told me about his experiments going out to buy Viagra for pandas. He screened panda pornography, so videos of other pandas having sex, in hopes that it might, kind of get the hormones going. We watched it as well. They show it to you, right? There's videos of pandas having sex. He bought sex toys. He went to female sex toys for the pandas. Nothing worked. They eventually figured out that female pandas are only fertile for 72 hours per year, so you have to know when to get them pregnant, I guess. And then they do IVF type things now, but.
I think I'll take this moment to say there will be audience questions coming up, so get your questions at the ready. Let's move to our final continent, North America, and there we have 3 bears. And actually, this is one of the good news stories, isn't it? That the black and the brown or grizzly bears are both increasing in numbers, isn't that right?
Yeah, a lot of the bear species in North America were kind of on the brink of extinction. Throughout the 20th century, when you had settlers come, they cleared away a lot of the bear populations or anything that could be seen as threatening. I think black bears in some states were down to 12 individuals left. Grizzly bears were down to around 300 by the 1970s. And today we have more than 2,500 grizzly bears in the lower 48. And they're expanding into new places. They're returning to their old haunts across much of the U.S. In Banff, actually, too, where we were, grizzly bears have been trying to move down into the prairies with not much success because people like to kill them. But they are kind of returning to a lot of places where they haven't been seen in hundreds of years. And there are also efforts to reintroduce grizzly bears into new places as well. So, it's still a very much a threatened population, but we are seeing, kind of this return of this, kind of king of the wilderness that we haven't seen in a long time.
And why is that? Is this about a change in human attitudes, or are bears becoming more adaptable and learning how to live with us, or is it a bit of both?
I would say it's been a pretty concerted change of human attitude, especially when it comes to the grizzly bear. I think it takes a shift in human temperament to be willing to live with an animal that can kill you, right? I was speaking earlier to someone and we were talking about, the reintroduction of eagles in Scotland, which will be, so it's a great film tomorrow screening on this as well. And it's one thing to bring back an animal that might kill some sheep, but it's very difficult to bring back an animal that can also kill you. And so I think human behavior, a willingness to make room for these animals really had to come first to be able to get grizzly bears to kind of return to places like Yellowstone. One of the most kind of hopeful stories is that there's kind of 6 recovery zones for grizzly bears in the United States, and there's a population up near Glacier National Park, Northern Continental Divide, there's the Yellowstone population, and those 2 bears have been island populations for, decades, if not a century, and they're within 90 kilometers of rejoining, and kind of there's a highway in between that they have to deal with, but they're very close to finally reconnecting. So I think that we're seeing a lot of progress on that front.
And there have been some amazing examples of human compassion and ingenuity there. I remember when I was in Canada before, learning about the bear kind of passages over the highways. Tell us more about them.
Yeah, Banff was actually the world leader in getting wildlife overpasses and underpasses into place to try and help grizzly bears and other animals cross roads. And when they first brought up the idea, they were kind of laughed out of town. Everyone was like, bears will never use this. But they did use it, and they used it very well, to the point where genetic diversity increased in Banff National Park because of how many times bears were crossing. Grizzly bears like to go over, and then the black bears like to go under, which kind of, black bears are forest animals, and grizzly bears are plains animals traditionally. So, but it's been a huge success story. It's been taken around North America to build these sorts of infrastructures in other places. We've seen big private land easements around national parks be bought up to create more space for grizzly bears, to stop them from getting into livestock and stop people asking for them to be killed. We've seen there's a testing center in West Yellowstone National Park where going back to my initial kind of interest in bears, they test out bear-resistant garbage bins. So once a year, they bring all these engineers and they stuff garbage bins and bear boxes full of food, and then they throw it into a pit of grizzly bears, and these are captive grizzlies, and they see if they can get into it or not. And then whichever one wins, gets deployed to national parks and to cities. So there's a lot of human efforts to try and save these animals.
Yeah, so this is really humans at our best, in fact, isn't it? Now, I know the answer to this question. You have a favorite bear, right?
I do. I'm very biased. I like the polar bear.
And was the polar bear always your favorite, or did you come back from your travels? Because you went to all the continents, didn't you, to see all of these bears. Was the polar bear your favorite going into this journey, or did you come back with him as your favorite?
It's a good question. I think that it was at the end of the journey that I kind of reflected which had been the most, powerful, but also maybe melancholy. And to be, I mean, I like all the bears, obviously. Like, they're all great in their own right. But I think just the polar bear seems so set apart from the other 7 species in terms, which is also funny because it's quite close genetically to brown bears. But it seems very distinct, right? Lives in a very impossible, unforgivable landscape. It, is huge, it's white. It just feels so different up in the Arctic. I also love the Arctic, so I think that that's a little bit of my bias there. But then also just I have a lot of empathy for the plight of the polar bear because scientists think the polar bear is, pretty much at this point guaranteed to go extinct. Most polar bear populations will be gone by 2100. We're seeing huge crashes in populations now in places like Western Hudson Bay, which is one of the lowest kind of populations of bears. Because of not as much ice there, right? So the ice is disappearing, their population is shrinking. Really only the bears in the very high Arctic will persist much beyond that. And I think, it's such a tragedy to look at these animals and to look into their eyes and think, there's decades left for this population and this species. So.
And you did go to Churchill, didn't you, which has been described as the polar bear capital. Did you look into a polar bear's eyes?
I did look into a polar bear. It's the easiest place to see polar bears in many ways, right? They have all this infrastructure that's meant to see polar bears, and a lot of scientists also work out of there. So I'd gone up with a scientist. But Churchill's it's an interesting place because it's a town that exists because of polar bear tourism. So what happens when you start having hundreds of starving polar bears? And that's a question that the town is grappling with now. Scientists have asked the question: will you start feeding the bears? Like, will you put food out? Will you do supplemental feeding to try and avoid the situation? But that's, there's no end to that because their habitat's disappearing. There's a polar bear jail where, when bears have been in town for too long, they get taken off to this old aircraft hangar and they're kind of put there until the sea ice comes back. And you're seeing, attacks also more frequently, not necessarily in Churchill, but around the Arctic, we're seeing an increase in human polar bear conflict because bears are on land for longer and they're hungry. So.
And even in Churchill, you said that people say, look both ways before you cross the road, and it's got a very different meaning.
I have a little sign that I got that says, like, look both ways for polar bears when you leave the building. A lot of them have that. And yeah, people don't lock their cars, they don't lock their doors in Churchill just in case, the polar bears are migrating through this area every October to the sea ice. So there's a lot of bears, and I think sometimes there's 60 bears nearby, on any one given day. So. Yeah.
There was a very interesting story you told about a woman who was attacked by a polar bear and left Churchill. And then what happened?
Yeah, she was a very interesting person to meet. So she was from Montreal, Canada, originally, and she'd moved up just to work in the tourism industry in Churchill in the early 2010s. And then she's probably one of the most famous victims of a polar bear attack, and the fact that she lived. It was Halloween night. She was walking through an alleyway around 5 in the morning, which is a kind of, you don't do that in Churchill, but presumably they'd been out partying a bit. And all of a sudden she looks and a polar bear is running down the alleyway and it gets her head in its jaws and it's thrashing her about. And a man heard the commotion. He came out. Her friends were there trying to throw things at the bear. A man came out and he started hitting it with a shovel. The bear then attacked him. And then eventually I think someone got into their truck and they kind of drove at the bear and scared it away. And then just to give a good idea of how many bears are around at any one time, the authorities initially shot and killed the wrong polar bear, that was also in town at the exact same time. So she left, she went back to Montreal, and then she eventually just found it was hard to deal with living back in, so far away from this terrible thing that had happened to her that she actually wanted to move back to Churchill. And so when I met her, she was still working there. She was working in a gift shop. She was like a huge bear champion, and she was actually selling these little spectacled bear trinkets to support Andean bear conservation in Peru. So she had learned about all the other bears since then. She was a big advocate of polar bear conservation. It was kind of a beautiful story of, even though this terrible thing had happened to her, she turned it into something positive for bears.
And moved back into the community that really understood about
Exactly, and helped her
bears
heal
and bear
through that
attacks.
process.
Yeah, it's a really optimistic end to that chapter, I thought. Just before we get and open this out to questions, I'm kind of interested in the process. Like, how did you decide how to structure this book, and how long did it take to do all of this research and go visit all of these bears?
Yeah, well, I went bear by bear, which is a very easy, in some ways it's the obvious structure, but there was discussions about, would we do it by different environmental threats, which is a bit tricky because, I kind of chose each bear to be a narrative vehicle for a different threat. But at the same time, a lot of these bears are impacted by multiple threats, right? So, the Andean bear is mining, it's climate change, it's agriculture. It's not just one thing that's threatening these animals, but I kind of focused on one specific thing for each bear. But it's funny, like I looked at my initial proposal, years later to see how I had initially proposed doing the book, the order of the bears, and it stayed like quite close to how I had initially conceived of it, and my editor didn't change things too much. We were saying we were kind of in a similar situation where we'd gone off and we'd done all of our adventures and our reporting. I was working on this book from 2017 through the end of 2019. And I was like, maybe I'll just sit and write for a year and a half and not travel anywhere. And then the pandemic hit, so that worked out perfectly. And I think Kate and I had these kind of writing groups online that kind of held us to account throughout the pandemic to get our books done. But yeah, I think there's a book called Bird by Bird as well. So when I kind of spoke with my editor, he was like, yes, bear by bear is the way to go. Yeah.
Bear by bear.
We considered calling the book that too. I was like, I don't know, it's a little too.
It was originally called Ursine Odysseys, wasn't it? Or that's what you wanted to call it?
Yeah, the subhead was originally an Ursine Odyssey, but then people thought that people don't know what the word Ursine means. So I don't know how many people know what Ursine means.
I'm absolutely sure this audience knows.
I thought 8 Bears was and 8 Bears is it's a very on-the-nose description of what the book is, but I think what works with this title is that people instantly want to guess what the bears are, and they're also surprised, right? They both think that there's more than 8, but then when you ask them how many they can name, they can only name 4. So I don't know. It's an interesting kind of opener. It's a discussion opener about bears, I think. Sure. Yeah.
Would anybody like to ask Gloria any questions? In which case, wave, because they're quite dark.
There's one in the back, I think.
Yes, please, shout away.
Thanks for a great talk. I have a slightly cheeky question. Your defining what a species is a really hard conservation question. Bears are actually a really interesting case doing that. So
yeah.
You define some bears on Borneo as a different taxonomic unit to the bear line on the mainland, but you also have, as you alluded, hybridization between polar bears and
Pizzly, yeah.
bears. Classically, those species of 2 individuals that can breed are the same species. That would put polar bears and grizzly bears in the same species. So I was curious, from your own conservation perspective, at any point were you having this debate about, okay, actually, what number do I want to say is the number of bear species there are?
Yeah, well, the genetic and evolutionary history of bears was my least favorite part of this book to research because it is so complex and there's so little disagreement, particularly with the subspecies, how many subspecies of bears there are, and grizzly bear is a subspecies of brown bear, and then there's 2, to your point, the 2 sun bear subspecies or species. I just went with what was defined by the internet IUCN, right? What kind of the experts say. There's specialist bear groups laid out by the IUCN, and that's kind of how I chose the species. I don't think there's as much disagreement on species as there are subspecies. But yes, yeah, that's not my forte completely. So I spoke with a lot of scientists about their own research, went through a lot of evolutionary history of bear studies that I wish that I hadn't. Yeah, that's my answer. But it's a very good point that it's very complex. Even just figuring out how, I think seals are one of the closest relatives to bears. And actually, the panda, for example, people didn't know that the panda was a bear until the 1980s. They thought it was something else until genetic testing. So that's kind of split open the conversation of which bears belong to which groups. But yeah, it's a good question.
The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature.
Yes,
right?
I know, I hate that acronym. It's
Do they, to that question, do they have a view on what's going on with the interbreeding of grizzlies and polar bears?
Well, so polar bears evolved out of brown bears roughly 500,000 years ago, which makes them new, scientists tell me. They're a newer species. But because of that, both brown bears and polar bears can create fertile hybrids known as growler bears or pizzly bears. And so there was scientists are very kind of concerned about the interbreeding in the future as kind of we're seeing many more brown bears moving north, and polar bears, of course, are being threatened and spending more time on land. And so there's some concern about eventually kind of the brown bear DNA swamping the polar bear DNA and just reverting all of the bears back to brown bears in the Arctic. And scientists do think, some of the world's leading polar bear scientists think that is what will eventually happen, is that it will just be brown bears in the Arctic. But there was a kind of humorous anecdote, which is that they were suddenly seeing a huge uptick in the number of pizzly bears in the North American Arctic. And scientists were like, oh my God, like this is happening right now. Like we're seeing this wave of pizzly bear expansion. And then they did the genetic testing on the pizzly bears that had been hunted or captured, and all of the DNA kind of traced back to this one female polar bear who'd just been sleeping with a spate of brown bears. So okay, it's kind of just her thing. Like it's not widespread yet.
She needs to have a word with the pandas, eh? Do we have another question? Any more questions for Gloria?
Yes.
Yes, please.
They are not bears. They actually call them lesser pandas in China too, which is quite funny.
Was it red pandas?
Red pandas, yeah. So I think that's what people often get confused by, because a lot of people come up to me and they start fighting with me that pandas aren't bears. They refuse to believe that pandas are bears, but I think they're thinking of red pandas, which are actually, to the genetic testing, I think there's 2 species of red panda, which they discovered last year. And they are closer to raccoons, I believe, but they're kind of their complete own thing. They don't really line up with anything else. Koala bears are also not bears, in case anyone wanted to know that.
And the sloth bear was thought to be a sloth.
The sloth bear was thought to be a sloth for some reason that is lost on me, because it looks nothing like a sloth.
Doesn't behave like a sloth. Right?
It's not very slothen, it's not at all sloth-like, especially with the disemboweling. So, yeah. Any more?
One more question. Somebody out there.
What was your favourite bear encounter researching the book?
Ooh, my favorite bear encounter. I mean, I had a lot of sad bear encounters. I did get to feed a panda, which was nice. A captive panda, obviously. China had this whole thing where you can kind of volunteer as a panda keeper for the day. You pay money to, of course, do this. And most of your time is spent, doing, cleaning up panda poop, breaking bamboo. But they let you feed a panda at one point. And so you kind of give it its snacks through the bar. You can also pay another $200 to have a selfie with a panda. But then they stopped doing that because a panda bit someone on the ear, and so they had to stop. Pandas will attack people, actually. There's there've been a few people at the Beijing Zoo who've jumped into the panda enclosures in hopes of trying to pet the panda. And there was one very famous panda known as Gugu, and he mauled 3 different people who did this. He tore their legs apart.
Whoa.
There are images online of the scientific paper about pandas attacking people. So no, they're not the friendliest bear if they're kind of disturbed in that way, I guess. But yeah, I would say probably maybe the panda, the polar bear encounter too. I would say I think they're just such beautiful animals. It's very evocative to picture their life out on the sea ice and then seeing them come ashore. I thought that was. I was never nearly almost attacked. People like to ask that question a lot. I did debate when I was struggling with how to open the book. I was maybe if I just go into the woods with some salmon, just for a fun, enticing opening, right? The near bear attack. But no, I did not have any close calls.
Well, I think we're really, really glad about that. We're very grateful to have you here in an unmauled...
Not being a Meals on Wheels.
Not being a Meals on Wheels. I mean, this book, it really kind of shows us the best and the worst of humanity, and it has been described as essential reading about the ongoing conflict between humans in the Anthropocene and the rest of the natural world. I have to ask you whether you came out of it more optimistic, less optimistic? Do we have any reason to be optimistic?
Well, I'm a journalist, is typically how I answer that question, which I think lends itself to a degree of cynicism. I think that there were, I felt very strongly about the ending, and that I think there are a lot of nature and environment writing books that kind of tell you all of these terrible things and then tell you, but there's still hope, but they don't really clarify, what that hope is. And I think my kind of takeaway is that, for species like the polar bear, even if we stopped climate warming emissions tomorrow, which we're not doing, the sea ice would still continue to melt, right? So there's certain species where there's really not much hope left, and we're bearing witness, which is another possible title, to kind of the demise of some of these species. But I think at the same time, I would argue for the panda, there's fewer than 2,000 pandas left in the wild, but I don't see them going extinct, because I think that there's certain people who are so, there's so much money going to protection, the Chinese government's doing so much that it's unlikely that would happen. So I think I have measured hope for some species. I think we can look to the people who have dedicated their lives to these animals. I think everyone here, everyone's at this festival this week is here because they do love, natural places and landscapes and the species that they contain. But I also didn't want to have too much kind of like false hope for, unfortunately, some species we've kind of decided their fate in this world already.
I think we'll leave it there. Gloria, thank you so much for writing this book, which is just fascinating and thought-provoking. And thank you also for your compassion for bears and for the rest of the natural world, and for being here with us this morning. I highly recommend that you grab yourself a copy and then go hibernate with it on sale at the back there. And Gloria will be signing after this session. A massive thank you again to Gloria Dickie for being here with us today, to the KMF team, and especially to our volunteers, to Cotswold Outdoor, and above all to you, the audience, for being here with us. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you, Kate.